Well, hello, everybody. This is Rabbi Dan Levin, and this is Essential Questions. America is a nation of immigrants. Since Europeans first established their colonies and communities on the shores of North America in the 16th century, America has been a nation in which peoples came for religious liberty, economic opportunity, to escape persecution, and to join in the pursuit of the American dream, to live in a nation where it was self-evident that all were created equal, with the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, with the freedoms of speech, the press, religious expression, and peaceful gathering. Emma Lazarus's words on the Statue of Liberty capture the spirit of what our nation strove to be. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep ancient lands your storied pomp, cries she, with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. The Torah reminds us on 36 different occasions that it is our obligation to show love for the stranger, to treat the stranger just as we treat the citizen, and to ensure that the vulnerability of the stranger is secured by our protection. Ilana Steinhain of the Shalom Hartman Institute teaches that the book of Leviticus teaches us to love our neighbor as ourselves, ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love the person who is kamocha, who is like you. But later in the same chapter, the Torah teaches, the stranger who resides with you shall be to you as one of your citizens. You shall love them as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You must love the stranger, shehu lo kamocha, who is not like you. We are obligated to leave the edges of our fields unharvested, and to leave behind the gleaning so that the stranger not only is given the means to feed themselves, but also ensures their dignity. At the same time, we are also a people who believe deeply in the rule of law and the importance in upholding the rule of law. The Talmud teaches in Tractate Baba Kama, the sinner should not be rewarded by law for their misdeed. And we have been taught that it is also our obligation to protect and defend our borders. The book of Deuteronomy teaches, may your doorbolts be iron and copper, and your security last all your days. Commenting on this verse, Rashi suggests, the mighty men of Israel would dwell in the border towns and lock the frontier, so no enemies could enter. It was as if it were closed with locks and bars of iron and brass. And as questions about what should be our nation's policies surrounding immigration play out on our nation's streets, today we welcome two extraordinary guests to help us think through the complex question of what should we be doing about immigration. Rabbi Sarah Bassin serves as the rabbi-in-residence for HIAS, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, where she connects Jewish tradition and communities to the work of aiding and advocating for immigrants, refugees, and other forcibly displaced populations. Before her role at HIAS, she began her rabbinate as the founding executive director of New Ground, a Muslim-Jewish partnership for change, where she built minority-based coalitions and served as the associate rabbi of Temple Emmanuel of Beverly Hills. Rabbi Bassin has built an expertise in interfaith civilian diplomacy, traveling with delegations of faith and political leaders to Mexico, England, France, Germany, Qatar, Azerbaijan, and Iran. Occasionally, she adds to her IMDb page as a consultant for depictions of Jewish content and community on film and television. Bill Gerstein is a member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, certified as an expert in immigration and nationality law by the Florida Bar, and has been practicing immigration law since 1995. He is a member of the Florida and Georgia Bar and has also been admitted to the United States Federal Court for the Southern District of Florida. Sarah and Bill, thanks so much for being with us on Essential Questions.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Sarah, tell us a little bit about HIAS, about the organization that you serve, and what it was about the questions of immigration and working with the immigrant community that called you.
HIAS is one of the most established legacy organizations in the American Jewish community. It was founded as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. We had been around for more than 120 years. We were originally founded as a Landsmannschaften, as an organization like many other ethnic groups in the United States had to welcome their fellow brothers and sisters from the old country, come to a new land, get settled, get those early things that they need to set them up for success. But over the years, HIAS really evolved not just to serve the new immigrant Jewish community that was arriving to the shores of the United States, but also to help Jews who were fleeing from dangerous places abroad. And over the course of time, as the need of the Jewish community lessened for forcible displacement of Jews around the world, we had a choice to make of whether we wanted to take that century plus of expertise that we had built up in serving the Jewish community and apply it to others who were still in need, or whether we were done with our sense of our mandate. And what attracted me to work for HIAS was precisely the fact that we took that experience of having been the stranger and chose not only to apply it to ourselves, but to understand it as a universal value that everybody is deserving of dignity, welcome, safety, and opportunity.
And so in your rabbinate, in the different experiences that you had, what was it about that mission that spoke to you?
I've always been drawn to religion, to the rabbinate, as a means of impacting our social good as a whole. I started off my rabbinate not in the congregation, but as the director of a joint Muslim and Jewish organization that was designed to address the real dysfunction between those two communities and how they related to each other here in the United States. I then served a congregation in the capacity as an associate rabbi and really understood the good that congregations can do on a grassroots level of transforming some of the social ills that surround us, of serving homeless populations, of helping those who are more vulnerable in our society. And so when this job opened up to help HIAS, particularly unleash the power of congregations in support of HIAS's mission of welcome, it was the perfect intersection of the things that both I value and the skill set that I was bringing to the table.
I love that story because I think so much of what Jewish tradition and certainly Jewish moral tradition teaches is that those who are vulnerable, those who do not have the means to provide or take care or defend themselves, are not to be tossed about by the whims of the powerful, but are to be protected and cared for in the nexus of community. That is the collective responsibility of the community to look out for the people, not only who are vulnerable within the community, but the people who are vulnerable because they are not part of that community. And that's why I'm so drawn by some of our textual tradition that talks about loving the stranger. You take a look at Leviticus 19, and it says, "Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And Ilana Stein-Hain, who teaches at the Hartman Institute, once taught me something really powerful. She says, when you look at that phrase, love your neighbor, who kamocha, the one who was like you, well, that's kind of easy, right? But then later you get this passage about loving the stranger, the person who is lo kamocha, the person who is not like you. That it's your obligation not to open your heart just to the people that make sense to you, but to open your heart to the people who aren't from there. And our people certainly, over the course of the centuries, understand what it is to be the people who aren't from there. So, Bill, you went to Tulane and then went to law school.
Yes.
And there are any number of ways in which you could have chosen to practice law. But you and your wife, Dory, opened a practice in immigration law. Tell us what led you to want to practice immigration law as your specialty.
For starters, I do love foreign language and learning foreign language. From the time I was in sixth grade through graduating college, I took Spanish. I lived in Italy as a small child, and I studied Italian in college and in the summers in Italy. And I developed a knack for it. In fact, some of my college summers were spent at Camp Blue Star in North Carolina, where I was placed in charge of the Latin American bunk because I was the only one who can speak to them and give them an experience. Then that combined with a love for travel and the many experiences that our law school gave us for immigration opportunities. So they set me up with a paid fellowship. There was a clinic. I found a job in the private sector. So all of these things sort of led into it. And it's also an area of the law where you could genuinely help people and they're truly happy. They're truly thrilled. It's not something like divorce where probably both sides end up losers in some way.
So when you've been practicing this law for 30 years.
Yes.
What's changed over the 30 years from the time that you started practicing in the way that you've seen American immigration law evolve? What's different now than it was, say, 30 years? How have you seen America's posture toward immigration and the way our laws reflect that posture evolve over time?
Well, right around the time I started practicing is when they made a major update to the Immigration and Nationality Act called the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Control Act that enacted some penalties for people that had overstayed and didn't allow them to obtain residency directly in the U.S. without paying some sort of penalty or making them go abroad. And then that's something that we got used to over a long period of time and figured out how to practice and how to make things work. But this year has had a very different feeling in the sense that the immigration service, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service that we normally looked at as an agency through which we apply for benefits for our clients is suddenly becoming more of an enforcement agency. And it's taken on a very dark feeling and tone that you could see in their methods of adjudication and even their presentation to the public on social media.
Tell us a little bit about that. Tell me, if you can, obviously, within whatever restrictions you have, what are the kinds of cases that you're seeing today that are different from the cases you had to handle maybe even just a few years ago?
Well, for example, if somebody applied for a benefit, let's say that we had somebody that was a resident for however many years and would apply for citizenship. During the citizenship interview, it was discovered that maybe there was some question about how they obtained their residency. So normally after a certain amount of time, after generally about 5 years, they generally would leave it alone unless there was some kind of massive fraud. Not just a question of, for example, if it was through a marriage, what was the quality of that relationship? Now, they would put somebody right into deportation proceedings. It's called removal proceedings upon denial of a benefit like that. Whereas in the past, that would not be something you would expect. You would expect that if it's something that you couldn't cure, that you would just leave it alone, that you wouldn't continue to apply for the naturalization, but that you would live as a permanent resident. And now even that is in jeopardy.
So it's interesting because my mother came from Canada in 1962, I think, late 1962, 63, to the United States and came to work and eventually obtained her green card and lived with her green card until she finally chose to be a naturalized citizen in 1988. I remember studying with her for her citizenship exam which was not a small thing by any stretch of the imagination. You had to know a whole bunch of American history and elements of American law and expectations and culture. You had to know some English, which my mom, coming from Canada, actually had an easy time. I remember at her citizenship exam, the examiner said, "Please write the following sentence in English: I am a wonderful mother," which she was and remains. But I remember not being worried about her immigration status. We never even thought of her so much as an immigrant. She had her Canadian passport. We had our American passports. She had her green card. We actually teased her, you stop complaining about American politics until you vote here. And so she finally decided to get her American citizenship. But then I also am aware that that is not the case for many, many people who desire to get their American citizenship. Tell us, Bill, a little bit. Let's say I am from some other country. Maybe it's the United Kingdom. Maybe it's Israel. Maybe it's Canada. Maybe it's somewhere in Latin America or the Far East or wherever it might be in Asia. And I want to become an American citizen. How does it work? What do you have to do if you want to be a legal American immigrant?
Well, first, you would have to have a path to permanent residency, which means green card. That you would have to obtain by a family sponsorship if you had such a relationship, or it could be obtained by employment sponsorship or by investment or by the green card lottery or by being granted asylum. So those are all different paths to become a resident. Once you are a resident, it's generally a 5-year wait to apply to become a naturalized U.S. citizen with some exceptions.
So just to get to the United States, I got to get a visa, right? That's if I want to come and I want to go to Washington, D.C. and have Rabbi Bassin tour me around all the monuments and have my opportunity to explore the United States. I got to get a visa. And that's not easy for many, many, many people from many, many different places. But if I wanted to come and live in the United States, I either have to have family here who will sponsor me, or I have to have an employer who will sponsor me. And I'm aware of that from the synagogue because on occasion we want to bring on a member of our team who has roots in another country, and we have to sponsor them as the organization that will offer them employment. So I'm aware of that. Or there's a lottery, right? There's just a few that you can sign up for, though I imagine. How many are there? And what's the likelihood that someone can get one of those lottery tickets, so to speak?
First of all, it's called a diversity lottery. So the point of it is that the countries that send the most people to the U.S. are exempted from it so that we could diversify the population by having people from countries that have a much smaller representation. So the way that it works is they make an online application in the month of October. And then in the month of May, the State Department announces who has been selected. And then there's basically a race to apply for and be granted the permanent residency before the numbers run out as they select more people than there are spaces.
How many spaces are there in a given year?
There's 50,000, and whoever wins is able to bring their immediate family, so their spouse and their minor children children under 21 that are not married. So any one person that wins could be theoretically bringing 4, 5, 6 people with them.
Okay. So, and then there is the case of asylum, where someone is coming because they are in danger to remain in the country where they have their own citizenship.
That's true.
So of the people who try to come to the United States, there's been, I think, because of so much turmoil in other countries like Haiti, like Honduras, like Latin America and Central America, and certain places that are very, very difficult for many people. How many asylum cases does the United States have to entertain in a year?
I don't really know the specific figures. It's not a concentration of our practice, but I can tell you that there are quite a few applicants. There is a limit to how many, after they're granted asylum, each year can apply for the residency. But it's a system that's often abused. I can definitely tell you that, and is very difficult to navigate.
So I remember, Sarah, I think you were there when we had a conference in San Diego a number of years ago, and the Jewish Family Services of San Diego showed us all the different ways in which they tried to offer support for people who had cleared the immigration center and then had to go find their way somewhere in the United States until either a hearing was scheduled or until their status had been determined. What kinds of things do you see either the Jewish community or the broader community doing to try to support people once they get here?
What we do to support people is extensive. The Jewish Family Services and other organizations around the country, many of them faith-based, will do everything from employment help, helping people find and locate jobs, identifying housing, doing language and integration and job training, all sorts of different things that set people up for building the skills that they'll need to be self-sufficient within the country. I do think it's important, though, to note that the number of people seeking asylum in this country, those pathways have narrowed intensely, especially under this administration, but also under the previous administration. The ability to claim asylum begins when you show up at a port of entry and indicates that you are in danger in your home country and that you are seeking refuge, that you are in fear for your safety. And slowly, the ability to do that has become more and more difficult. It began with not being able to present yourself at a port of entry without an appointment. So what did people do? If the technicality that they had to meet was to step foot onto American soil, they would swim across the river, flag down a border patrol agent in order to turn themselves in to say, I am on American soil. I would now like to exercise my rights, my human rights to request asylum. By the way, the asylum system, this whole notion of having the human right to seek asylum, this came in the aftermath of World War II, when there was a global acknowledgement of the failure during the Holocaust to allow some place for people to flee when their lives were in danger. So we established and bought into this universal commitment that in the very least, people should not have to stay in a place where they feel like their life is under threat.
I remember learning the history of the St. Louis, that in September 1938, there were a group of Jewish refugees trying to make their way anywhere that would be safe, and they were given forged Cuban visas. They were unaware that they weren't proper visas. This was actually a ploy by the SS to prove to the world that no one wanted the Jews. And so they all boarded the St. Louis. Captain Schroeder left from Hamburg for Havana, and then they radioed ahead to say, hey, all of these refugees on board have fraudulent visas. The Cuban authorities would not allow any of them to land. Eventually, the St. Louis was forced out of the Havana harbor, and they were off of the coast of Miami Beach. You could see the ship from the beach, and they could see people on the beach, and there was enormous pressure brought by the Jewish community on President Roosevelt to allow these people to ask for asylum. They were desperately seeking the most dangerous of circumstances, and President Roosevelt and the State Department refused. Eventually, that ship had to return to Europe, and a third of the people who were on board that ship were caught up and killed in the Holocaust. So this idea after that people should be able to claim asylum was one of the remedies that we bore the brunt of knowing as a people from our own experience.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, in a few days, your congregation is going to be doing a vigil that draws upon the stories of those victims of the St. Louis, the hundreds of people who did not survive because they were murdered, having been returned to the shores of Europe. And to think about the stories today of people who are being denied refuge as well. A lot of it under the rationale of bureaucratic reasons, right? When they were turned away from the United States, it was because their documentation was not in order. And ultimately, what it was actually about was that public sentiment was highly isolationist, highly xenophobic. More than 83% of the American public at the time was skeptical or opposed to accepting Jewish refugees because they saw them as an economic drain, as a cultural threat, as potentially increasing the chances of violent crime. None of these things statistically bore out in our history of immigration. Those things just are not disproportionately true of immigrants. In fact, they are often generators of economic development. There's so many pragmatic reasons beyond the moral reasons to welcome people. But the pressure when we get into these isolationist mood swings as a country can be enormous, and it can be very easy to exploit politically and offer a scapegoat and say, if we do not open our doors to people who come from different backgrounds, then our problems will disappear, our problems will go away, our problems will be mitigated. That's not to say we don't need a system that is structured and organized and offers due process. I'm not saying open borders, but there is a very big distinction between giving into these waves of xenophobia and having the appropriate structures to allow for a culture of welcome that allows us to benefit from all of the energy and vibrance that immigrants bring.
I think also there's a misconception about what is asked of people who are immigrants, who are seeking asylum, or who are trying to get that permanent residency. Previously, President Trump in his first administration talked about creating a process of what I believe he called extreme vetting. And what I remember is prior to that, it looked like we already had a process that was pretty extreme in vetting. Bill, can you talk a little bit about the kinds of vetting that happens in order for someone to either get a residency or a permanent residency or eventually naturalized citizenship?
Well, they definitely go through a background check. They're fingerprinted. They have to complete an application and answer truthfully at an interview. And depending on what violations there are, there may be a waiver for it, or there may be no way around it. As far as how people are vetted for visas, I think it's a lot of profiling because they're often given less than a minute in an interview for a visitor's visa. So there's some method they have of profiling, but I feel that that's something that's gone on definitely even before this administration. This administration, they're making it known that they want the social media identifiers of people, which I think has a very chilling effect, that you're not allowed to have an opinion unless it's an opinion that jives with this administration.
So tell me a little bit more about that. What kinds of changes in vetting is the government doing before they're able to offer someone residency or to move forward in their application for citizenship? What other, besides you said they're fingerprinted, they're looking for, I guess, a background check. What other kinds of things are they looking for? What are the pitfalls that people can fall into where that might trip up their application?
An application for naturalization could be denied for a false claim to citizenship. So it could be as simple as you go to get your driver's license. They don't realize at the driver's license office that you're from a foreign country. They register you to vote. You think that because they did it, that it was okay, and you vote. That's a false claim to citizenship that under this current administration is extremely serious and is being investigated very carefully. Other ways would be non-payment of taxes, committing a crime within what they call the statutory period, so the period leading up to the application, not supporting your dependents, so like not paying child support, for example, is another reason. Those are the most common.
So there is, some way of saying that sounds fairly reasonable, right? If somebody isn't following American law, if someone is not being a responsible person as the law would require, then it seems like it's reasonable for a country to say that should interrupt your path towards residency and citizenship.
Right.
Are there times, though, when you see people's pathways to residency or citizenship interrupted in ways that seem challenging or beyond what the intent of the law might be?
The officers, especially for permanent residency, are given a great deal of discretion. And even if somebody meets the requirements of residency, they can be denied for discretion. I haven't seen it yet on anything based on social media or political opinion, but I think it could be coming.
So can you give us an example, perhaps, of a case where you saw someone just using their discretion in a way that didn't seem to be warranted?
Say you have somebody that had an arrest for domestic violence because they had a fight. It could even be a verbal altercation with a spouse or a significant other, and no matter how long ago. The officer could say, well, the case was dismissed against you, so you're not barred in the sense that you committed a criminal act, but you just don't seem like the type of person, like a good person that we would want here. And it's totally within their discretion.
So if, for example, a couple got in a fight and it ended up that the police were called, but no charges were filed, but there's an arrest record or there's a record of the altercation, that in and of itself might...
Yes, exactly.
And the person who investigates that, is there an appeals process where a person can say, well, I appreciate that you think that this would disqualify me, but I'd like to speak to your supervisor?
There's a process where you can apply to reopen your case, but it's basically with the same agency. So what could happen after that is if the person that was denied no longer has their non-immigrant status, let's say they were a student and they're not at the school anymore, they can then be placed into removal proceedings where it's then going to be up to the judge's discretion.
So there's a lot of conversation that we have in America about a category of folks that are sometimes called the dreamers. And these would be people who came to the United States. They may have come legally initially with their families and for all kinds of different reasons didn't ever realize full status as residents, but grew up here and have no recognition or memory of their life in what was their original home country because they came when they were 4, 5, 6 years old and grew up in the United States and lived in the United States and think of the United States as their home. And there's been back and forth about what should be the status of those individuals. So, Sarah, in your work, have you come across people who kind of fall into that category? And what's been your experience of working with them as they try to figure out their pathway forward as Americans?
Well, first of all, I think it's worthwhile to acknowledge that we have many dreamers within the Jewish community. This is not an issue that is outside of the Jewish community. This is something that impacts us directly. And I would say dreamers are one of the categories that is most significant. And I would say something that we're seeing just in general is that people who have had either some kind of status or some kind of assurance provided to them of their security, right? Dreamers were provided with assurance, right? If they came forward, if they registered, that you keep yourself clean, you will not be put in any sort of deportation proceedings. There are a lot of people who came here and received humanitarian parole, hundreds of thousands of people. Those statuses, in many cases, are now either in question, being allowed to expire, or being actively revoked, which is exacerbating the issue of increasing the undocumented population in our country. If part of what we are trying to do is a common sense approach of decreasing the number of people who are here undocumented, then it would strike me that the last thing we want to do is to force more people into that status.
So in the Talmud, in Baba Kama, there is a passage where the rabbis say, Rabbi, the sinner should not be rewarded by law for his misdeed.
And that seems to be an ethos that we hear around the question of immigration, especially those who have not attained their process through a legal channel. Either they overstayed a visa and remained as citizens, or they violated the law in certain ways and they are here without legal status. How would you, in your work, say that we should apply that sort of moral ethic, the idea of not rewarding someone for a misdeed, in which case some people say, well, that if we provide a pathway to citizenship for people who didn't follow a legal pathway, we're essentially condoning or even encouraging that kind of non-legal behavior. In your work, Rabbi Bassin, how do you sort of wrestle with those questions?
Many of the infractions that people carry out in pursuit of coming to the United States are at about the legal equivalent of a parking ticket, right? The irregular crossing into the United States has not been a criminal offense. People make decisions that are deeply rational for their own safety and security. So if what you are fleeing is a life of destitution, a life of targeted gang violence, of political violence, of being targeted for your identity, gender, religious, queer, otherwise, if that is what you are fleeing, and the decision that you are being forced to make because you don't have a legal opportunity to present yourself at a port of entry and say, I am in danger, I am in need of help, then yeah, it's a really rational decision to find another way in to be able to initiate that same process. For me, that does not categorically fall into a container of moral failing, of sin. That, to me, is actually more of a problem in the way that we have structured our laws and our systems in an attempt to disincentivize people from using and enacting that human right of requesting asylum. The sinner, in my experience, in my opinion, is not the person that is forced to irregularly enter the United States and flags down Border Patrol to be able to initiate and start the process, that shows up to court, that is doing their best to navigate the system as best they understand it. It's the country that is making it increasingly difficult and impossible for them to have the due process that they deserve.
And I think also part of the thing that I think about is in our tradition, there is an idea of a hierarchy of trespass. And when they talk about a hierarchy of trespass, what they mean is, for a more serious crime, you get a more serious consequence. So, for example, if someone goes into a convenience store and steals a pack of gum, we don't lock that person up in solitary confinement in a maximum security prison for 20 years because the punishment doesn't fit the severity of the trespass. And what it seems to be that we're seeing is a lopsided version in America of creating very, very, very serious consequences for trespasses that up till now were never seen to be of such an incredible nature that we would deport somebody or arrest someone and hold them in confinement indefinitely for weeks, months at a time because of a nonviolent trespass, like overstaying a visa. There's also a passage that I think about that comes from the Talmud where they talk about a guy who built his house using a stolen beam. Right? So like imagine there's a couple and they profess their love and they carve their initials onto a tree. And then they come back and someone has chopped down and stolen their tree. Right? And then years later, they're in someone's house and they look up at the main beam across the roof and you see their initials carved and they say, oh my gosh, you stole our wood. You stole this tree. The question is, what do you do in that case? So what they say is, in that case, you don't take the house apart to give back the stolen wood. You find another path to compensate the victim for their loss, but you don't tear the whole house down. It says, Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudgeta says, concerning a stolen crossbeam that the thief builds into a house, the victim takes only the value of the beam as compensation, but may not force the thief to return the beam itself. And that's because of someone where there is benefit of those who wish to repent. Right? So in our society, in our tradition, we're taught if someone does something wrong or illegal, we say, well, yes, you did something wrong or illegal. Let's find a path to correct it. Let's find a path to put you back in good stead. That's what the high holidays are all about. That's what all of Jewish tradition around repentance and teshuvah are about. And so when we think about the consequences or the path or the punishments even that we levy against someone for a nonviolent offense that may have taken place decades ago, it seems that there is a bit of a mismatch between the consequence and the actual trespass. So, Bill, when you have clients that come to you and they say, help me, are there pathways in American law where a person can say, yes, I trespassed, but I want to make good. I want to be a healthy American citizen. I want to be a supportive resident of the United States. What are the pathways that someone has that can help them to make good on maybe a mistake that they had made years before?
Well, there are certain waivers that are available for conduct as well as for illegal entry. So let's say that a person came illegally 10 years ago, then, met their future spouse, a U.S. citizen, and they have a home and they have children and everything. There isn't a direct path in the U.S. to obtain the residence for that person. Rather, what has to happen is they have to qualify for a waiver where they show that their U.S. citizen spouse would suffer extreme hardship were they not allowed to remain in the U.S. with them, or if that spouse had to move abroad with their foreign spouse. And upon granting of that waiver, which is quite slow, they then have to go overseas at the U.S. consulate overseas in their country to process for residency, and then they can return as a resident. So it's a long path, but there is one.
So as we get ready to conclude, Bill, if there were one or two things where you could wave your magic wand and say, this is how America should help repair elements of the immigration process, what would be one or two things that you wish you could see happen that would be good for those who seek immigration and good for America?
I think that this country needs to be realistic about the labor that we need, and we need a real guest worker program. So we do have some guest worker programs, but they provide very, very little relief. So, for example, there's a visa called the H-2B, and it's for temporary or seasonal work. So figure, you have a ski resort. It's obviously going to be in some, rural place in the mountains. There's only so many people that they could draw from the local population. So they go into this program so that they have people that they can bring in for the season, and then the people can go back home. And for a country of over 330 million to only have 65,000 of these a year is a joke. You could probably use those just in this county. So if we had a realistic guest worker program where we know who the people are, we bring them in to do these jobs that Americans are not signing up to do, they'll pay tax, they'll pay Social Security, they'll go home and they'll spend the money there and they'll better their lives and their families there. That I think would be good for all of us and allow Americans to strive for the best jobs.
And Rabbi Bassin, if you could wave your magic wand based on your work and fix one or two things that you think would make a difference, what would those be?
Two things. I would expand the legal pathways for temporary work permits and otherwise, but also I would reestablish and have a robust refugee admissions program. It's a travesty right now that is not in a place of functioning. but I would take the $170 billion that have just been allocated toward private prison expansion and toward deportation efforts, and I would put all of that money into funding immigration services, into funding immigration courts, expanding the number of immigration judges, and to start to address this very intentionally created backlog of cases, millions of cases that have not been able to be heard because we haven't had the capacity, we haven't invested in the system, we claimed that it was too expensive, and yet we found $170 billion for private prisons and deportation efforts. That's just not a reflection of the values that I want as an American or as a Jew.
I think that part of what I love about our tradition is the idea that we create a sense of balance, and that's really what justice is supposed to be, a balance between the needs to be open and caring and compassion, and the needs to ensure that the laws that we establish are followed so that there is order in society. But I think the thing that is most important for us is to resist the temptation that comes from the dehumanization of the other. I think we use language in our society by calling people illegals, as if a person's existence can be illegal, or trying to lump people all in as if you can paint a huge, broad, diverse cross-section of humanity with a single brushstroke. I think what we need to remember, and part of what our tradition demands that we remember, is that each and every one of the people who seek citizenship or asylum are created in the image of God, just like any of us. And for those who have taken advantage or violated the spirit of what our country offers, we should deny that person the benefits and the blessings. But for the extraordinary number of people who are seeking to have the same opportunities that we enjoy, the same opportunities that those who came before us who found our way into the United States are seeking, to remember that that is an individual with a heart and a soul and a family and cares and concerns and dreams and yearnings. And if we can remember that each and every one of those people is of infinite and ultimate value, perhaps we might be able to craft policies in our society that not only enrich our society, but extend the blessings of our society to those who seek the same blessings and opportunities that we enjoy. Rabbi Bassin and Bill Gerstein, thank you so very, very much for joining us today.
The Essential Questions podcast has been made possible by the Temple Beth El Jewish Ideas Incubator, committed to creativity and innovation in modern Jewish life. Many thanks to our production team. You can find this podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, and the Podbean app, as well as on Temple Beth El's website, tveboca.org/essential questions. Share this podcast with your friends. Rate us on Apple Podcast or Spotify to spread the word. And we want to know, what are your essential questions? Let us know by emailing us at eq@tveboca.org. I'm Rabbi Dan Levin, and thanks for listening to the Essential Questions podcast.